I am Obinna Emeka. I am a Nigerian writer and philosopher. In and about my journey in Eastern Europe, I've come to have this special love for the Polish people. First of all, I came to have great respect for the Polish people of the backdrop of the very fact that I was born Catholic, I was raised Catholic, and so in and about the era I was born was when the great John Paul II was Pope. He died in 2005. Um, a couple of years before I would first step my feet on the great Polish soil. I am currently working on a documentary on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and the conversations in and about things that can be found in the novel in terms of themes, in terms of style, in terms of intentionality, and the likes of that. And it explores the other works of Conrad, works like Lord Jim, and the likes of that. And for the collaboration down here with the organization here, one is asked to talk about the influence of Polish literature in one's own life. And I have a couple of recommendations as it concerns authors to look out for when one wants to talk about Polish literature. Whether I'll be biased or not is a conversation for another day, but what a good place to start from. You get to start with the works of Adama Mickiewicz, and then in and about that, you are looking at Pana Tadeusza, of course, as it concerns the era in which Poland was off the map, the confederation between Lithuania and Poland had gone its own way. Croatia, Austria, as well as Russia had taken great chunk of the country, and all of those type of conversation of the backdrop also at the Congress of Vienna and the likes of that. So we have this very beautiful epic written by the great Adam, a romanticist at that, but not a romanticist in the literal sense of it. A romanticist who rather showed what it really meant to be an exile and to carry one's own culture in one's own heart, one's own life, and move about that particular terrain. He was born in about this era, and he died before the liberation of his dear country. He would have been born in what would be known as current day Belarus, but he's Polish nonetheless, fully and completely. And he features also as one of the bards of Polish literature, or Polish romantic literature. That's Polish romanticism and the likes of that. And why would Pantadeusz be a book I would want people to read, migrants as well as Poles themselves? It is against the backdrop of the fact that, it was written by a man who dreamt, really, really dreamt. And from the very opening lines of the work, you get to see him talk about health. And health both in the literal sense and health in the allegorical sense. And what about health? You get to realize that you don't have good health. Maybe when you've lost it, you don't have good health. Maybe when you have become sick. And I, on my part, also have poor health. Experienced poor health for about 3-4 years before we were able to get a clear diagnosis. So one would understand in the periods leading up to the final diagnosis what it means to have closure in an abuse case, closure for one's own life, closure for a murder case in one's family, and closure for the certainty of what your life ought to be and how your life ought to go going forward. And it it's a lot that someone like Adam didn't live to Pan Adam didn't live to see the liberation of his own people. I think the liberation happened on the battlefields of the First World War. A lot of persons fought to see to it that that happened. You know, himself also died trying to organize a resistance, and much of his life was a life lived in Paris. He lectured down there. He became a college teacher, and nonetheless a poet. You know, a poet through and through, a poet to the very end of it. And for whatever has become of his life now, and the life of Poles, and the life of people around the Polish borders, you know, from Belarus on the one hand to modern day Ukraine and the war happening down there, down to even modern day Austria, um, its relationship with Germany and all of those type of conversations, or the Dutchland, and then the relationship with Russia still. One gets to see that Europe continues to fight for its identity, continues to fight for its place. You know, it has experienced relative peace in the last 60, 70 years down there, if you want to count the period of the Soviet, or off the backdrop of the Soviet. You talk about from the fall of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact in 1990. Um, you take away that particular part out, and then you're left with a relatively peaceful Europe. You know, the Cold War was fought down there, Kosovo happened, and different regional conversations down there. I think Europe nowadays is faced with other conversations, you know, migration, industrialization, whether we should bring back the industries back to Europe, or we should leave them in Bangladesh or in China. And in different places, they get to find themselves at the moment, maybe parts of Africa, parts of the Asian world, or the conversations about that also. And then there's a conversation as it concerns human rights, protest, ability to protest freely. There's a great divide going on between those who are in support of Israel and those who are in support of the Palestinian cause, and it's causing lots of divides among family members. And because we all know it's less than 100 years since the whole of this turmoil started. More than 100 years if you have to talk about the First World War, but more so where we saw a whole lot of issues came up was the backdrop of the Second World War, which is about 81, 82 years, depending on when you are situating liberations and the conversations thereof. And Pana Tadeusza again is a conversation I like to talk about because of the importance for the Polish people, off the backdrop of the very fact that, you know, there's 1918, in and about the period Czechoslovakia as well as Poland regained their independence after fighting in the First World War. But then shortly after that, in 1920, you have the miracle at Vistula, upon which you get to see that, you know, someone like the great Marshal Piłsudski would lead an army first heading down to Ukraine and halting the resistance rising from the Bolsheviks, and the whole conversations down there. You know, they were heading to Berlin, or attempts were made to head to Berlin, and then in another attempt to still pass through and head to Berlin, a campaign was staged at Vistula with little or no army. You know, it was a very, very young army, and Piłsudski himself, not ignorant of banditry and the whole conversations down there as it concerns the formulations of attacks and surprise attacks and the likes of that, led Poland to a victory in 1920, and it has come to be that same period whereby we mark the Armed Forces Day for the great people of Poland. And of that backdrop, there was a Second World War, and we all know what happened during the Second World War, and we see how situation of the backdrop of the Second World War took place, and Poland was greatly affected. It had the the highest population of concentration of Jews ever in the history of Europe at that particular time. And then there were extermination camps set, you know, you go to Krakow, you go to the concentration camps down there, and then you give a lot of things, and you're left with sheer wonders to how people have turned out the way they are and how life have come to be for them in the 21st century. And I think it's a very important thing to get to note down there how, against all odds, upon every situation the Polish people have found themselves, they find a way to rise. You know, you look at the Piast dynasty, or you look at the era in which the king decided to accept Christianity more so as a form of baptism to stability or to the prospect of getting a kind of European prowess down there, and then alliances were now formed, and then Sweden came. There was that conquest down there, and then you had the period leading up to the Lithuanian relationship that saw through the downfall many years later, and saw the country off the map. And so Pana Tadeusza, for me, is a work that every well-meaning individual ought to look at, because it can be situated in almost every part of the world, and then it would fit perfectly. And it's also against the backdrop of such a work one gets to talk about Conrad's Heart of Darkness, as it concerns the dispossession of a people and the squandering of their wealth and all that is of what they can have and all they can get and all they ought to have as a people, and all of those type of conversations still. And so you see Pana Tadeusza is playing out on many fronts. And then you also look at the modern day sense of geopolitics and the modern day sense of extractions and the different ways in which companies tend to go into different locations and different eventualities that come off that particular backdrop as it concerns how you dispossess the people and how life ought to go and how life should not go. And Bangladesh comes to mind handy because it's like almost like the cheapest place in the world to get to make fast fashion and get to produce textile and the likes of that. But then you also get to ask yourself, how much of those people have been dispossessed, and for how long are they going to continue like that, so that we can, continue to get our own comforts and the likes of that? Because I think that's also a theme you can pick off the backdrop of Pana Tadeusza and the conversation he had there. You see him go to the tavern, you see him talk to different persons, you see Adam look at the environment. No wonder it's called the title it's called as a book itself. The last foray of the Lithuania of Lithuania and conversations in and about that. Then you think after the liberation of the Polish people, or even during the period of the fighting, first before even the liberation, you find the Armia Krajowa, the clandestine Polish resistance force, doing greatly with little or nothing to their own side. And then you find not just them, you find also the Jewish resistance, be that of 1944, be that of 1943, that's the ghetto uprising, and then you see the 1944, and you see the Warsaw uprising itself. At the gates of the Warsaw Uprising Museum, one feels a quiet dread. The brick walls, the faint sound of marching boots, recorded for visitors, the photographs of faces now long gone, all of it gives a sense of being on the threshold of something immense, something really serious, something really, really deep, of a long silence. Yet the building itself is not the subject. It is only a door. Once that door is crossed, we step away from the glass cases and controlled exhibits. We are carried into a city, August 1944, a city that stood at the threshold of history and chose to set itself on fire rather than kneel again. And you see the fact that Stalin and his men retreated across the Vistula and watched while the Polish people almost got completely exterminated, or the people in Warsaw rather, because it was not a communist resistance. So Stalin did nothing. He told his men to retreat down there, but then lots of persons still nonetheless helped the people on the ground,
Warsaw in the summer of 1944 was a city exhausted, really, really exhausted. 5 years of Nazi occupation has stripped away everything: its dignity, its Jewish population, its freedom, its hope. To live in Warsaw during those years was to live under a shadow that deepened with each month passing. Executions were public, hunger was deliberate, streets once known for their music and laughter and all that had become corridors of silence. The city was an open wound.
There were boys, there were women, there were children, there were adults.
And beneath the rubble, a network of veins pulsed, the underground Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, a clandestine body of resistance that had been waiting for a moment that might never come.
Message left the country sparingly,
And by late July, the moment seemed to come. The Red Army had advanced westward, pushing the Germans back across the Vistula. In the west, American and British armies were breaking out of Normandy. From London came broadcasts promising that the final collapse of Hitler's Reich was close at hand. It was in that atmosphere that the Polish command made its fateful decision. If they rose up, if they took their own city back, they would meet the Soviets as a free force, not as a subject to be handed over.
People did very, very little to help that period, and it's a call to action. Maybe that's why the book is so relevant today.
In the heart of the occupied capital, a sense of timing, part desperation, part strategy, convinced them to act. And they acted. They acted in good faith. They acted patriotically. The order went out. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of August 1st, Warsaw would rise. What happened that day is hard to imagine now.
Because if you look at the very fact that if people were, as helpful as they're supposed to be, maybe Winston Churchill wouldn't have made the statement he made, statements along the lines of, if I should paraphrase, never in the history of the time has so much been owed to so few people. And it is true. Very little was done on time to see to it that stuffs come out pretty much very, very well. And you look on the one hand, there is Israel, there's Palestine. You look at the other hand, there's Sudan, there's Congo in Africa. You look at the other hand, there's Bangladesh. You look at the Indian or the Oriental world. There's the Buryatia under the occupation of Russia still. You look at Georgia, still the same stuff. Nicknamed one of the daughters of Stalin. You look at Ukraine close by, and you look at Russia. You look at the whole geopolitics that come out of that, and you look at the sheer sense of despair that people can find themselves in. Despair is a very, very seductive vice, or if it's not even a vice, seductive act. But how do you want to despair? James Baldwin, the American author who lived some part of his life in France, would get to tell you, how do you want to despair? What do you want to tell to your children? What do you want to tell your children that what? That their lives cannot get better? Is that what you want to tell your children? Is that what you want them to grow with? Is that how you want them to live their life? Is that how you want them to lead their life? That there's no hope? You want them to buy that particular piece of information that there's no hope? How do you want to sell them that particular data? You see, when you see that particular kind of conversation, you see, and then it reminds you also of Albert Camus, who talked about the whole idea of just waking up, just being alive. The conversation also is made of the fact that when you're surrounded by vultures, try as much as possible to stay alive. And that's what Pana Tadeusza is about for me. People have made arguments as it concerns the literal translation back to English. It doesn't matter so much. You can call it Mr. Tadeusz, you can call it Mr. Tadeusz if you are using proper English. You can say Sir Tadeusz, or Sir Tadeusz or Mr. Tadeusz and the likes of that. But that is left for people in the literary studies world and practitioners of semantics and the likes of that. What we are to look out is to look out for the heart of the matter, and the heart of the matter is that the Polish people, against all odds, have tried to survive, and the resistance is real, and the resistance is a very, very strong thing amongst Poles. I have researched in Poland. I have had lots of Polish friends. I have spoken to lots of Poles. I have lots of friends who admire me, and also get to admire. And I have friends who have spoken to as it concerns the eventualities of the backdrop of the research I am doing and the works I am working on, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and my own trilogy also I'm working as it concerns Polish history. And of that backdrop of the Second World War, after liberation came, there was the occupation, there was the crisis between Poland and modern day Ukraine, and many persons still bear grudge against Ukrainians, but it's an understandable grudge, right? But then also there was the period of the occupation. Now, the Soviet took charge of a whole lot of stuff. There were bread lines. Poland was more or less cut off from the world. Lots of stuff weren't going on. But even before I forget, during the Warsaw uprising, there were African pilots supplying materials down here. South Africa particularly contributed a great chunk of pilots that saw to it that relief materials were sent to Poland during the period of the Warsaw uprising, and conversations in and about that, which is a very, very interesting thing for me as an African, also myself, for the very fact that my people, as it's already known in history, this is not historical revisionism, fought in the Second World War, and in the World Wars rather, and it goes to say a whole lot. Though the colonies were also fighting themselves on the continent, soldiers were equally sent down here. Indian soldiers and a whole lot of other persons also were fought, and there's a growing population of Afro-Polish Poles, if I should put it that way, who come from Kenya. Either the mother is from Kenya or the father is from Kenya, or the father is from Uganda, the mother is from Poland. One way or the other, the history gets to intertwine. I know a whole lot of persons who I now call family, right? I know Allah on the one hand. There's I have to call it that particular way. There's Kitty Sarcasm. She prefers that particular name to her real name to say, and then there's a whole lot of other persons down there who found themselves one way or the other. There's Lut, I know, who is also doing great films in Poland. You get to look at different persons. There's Mamadou down here who've been here ever since the 80s. A great man on his own feet, a great broadcaster, one I look up to as it concerns broadcasting and the likes of that. And then you push down, there were the resistance, there were the period of solidarity, the solidarity movement down there. Priests died, people were killed. Non-violence was on the one hand, there was also violence on the other hand. And then people were just wanting to fight for their freedom. It granted James Bowen that remarkable chance to talk about, Poles asking for, give me freedom or give me death, give me liberty or give me death, and talk about bravery. And also he used that also to critique the fact that blacks couldn't or weren't allowed to fight for their own rights and the likes of that, or they will be made examples of. And then you have the 90s, you have John Paul coming in, and then you have the 90s, and off the backdrop of the 90s, you have radical capitalism introduced. There was mafia life on the one hand, there were lots of hardship because people were just coming off the backdrop of this sense of communism and then this sense of Soviet idealism and the likes of that, and then bread lines were no longer there for a couple of persons. People have been plunged into alcoholism by the introduction of vodka to keep their bodies strong and then their minds weak, and all of those type of conversation. And of that particular backdrop, oligarchs were formed, from old and corrupt money. Nonetheless, people saw to it that they strive, and then some fled the country, some stayed back to build the country. We have lots of British Poles now, American Poles, Poles in Germany, Poles in different parts of the world, Poles also in Israel, and all of those type of conversations down there for good and for bad reasons too. And then you have the late 90s, you have the early 2000s, you have the canonization of Santa Maria Kowalska. You have Saint Maria Faustina was canonized down there, and then Pope John Paul died in 2005. The Soviet, the NATO is being introduced and accepted by the people, and then Poland becomes this member state, and lots of stuff go on to show how far the Poles can get to go, and then lots of conversations have really been had. Right, Russia attempted to invade Georgia and has done that on multiple fronts. Invaded Ukraine in 2014, and then did that also again. The war that has continued down here, Poles helped lots of Ukrainians, and against the backdrop of what the president said, as it concerns as the president of Poland, doing that Poles need to do more in terms of appreciating what Ukraine does for Poland. I think I don't really agree, because we were all here and we saw what happened at the intersection of war, and how Poles, not the government, how Poles, a few politicians also came out, but lots of Poles were the ones at the forefront of accepting their brothers and sisters on the continental base, and also from a place of ancestry and a place of history, to their neighborhood and to their country. Warsaw Central Station was piled up. If you've gone to Krakow, the trains kept coming, and then many persons had to relive this memory of the backdrop of probably what they were told from history books and the likes of that. So, why am I talking about Pana Tadeusza? We've gone these 360s just to come to really, really understand against the backdrop why this place is so important. And so next time you visit Poland, and then you see lots of wreaths almost everywhere, you see lots of candles and lots of flags on almost every building. Come to tell yourself that this is a country that has really, really gone through a lot. Much of Warsaw, in fact, almost all parts of Warsaw was rebuilt, because the city was bombarded after the resistance army gave up their fight, after they had staged their resistance from the 1st of October, the 1st of August 1944 till I think the end of September, and then them giving up and surrendering, I think, first week of October, and they were evacuated, and then the country was the city was bombarded, and then the rebuilding came off the backdrop of them wanting to mount gates and mount watchtowers in the entrance and the exit of the country, and all of those type of conversations. For me, as someone who writes about Polish history, as well as someone who research about Polish writers to get to understand the place better from a historical standpoint, and living here also, as well as living to go to Germany, to go research in Belgium, to go to Greece, and then to find oneself in Czechia, to look at old Czechoslovakia and the whole idea of Aranization and the annexation of properties and all of those type of conversations. One is moved by the sheer idea that almost everywhere one gets to step, one is marching on blood. One is marching on resistance. You cannot really tell now, it has all been washed off over the years. Snow has come, rain has taken lots of stuff away. But if you look back through history, you come to see to it that, lots of stuff has happened in a very, very short period of time. That sometimes you begin to ask yourself, how do Poles manage their history? How do Poles manage their sense of understanding of their own people and their own selves? Because lots of stuff have really, really gone on within this period of time, within this short period of time. These people of so many great fights have come to be the type of people they are. And so when you see certain sense and attitude towards migration and all that, you should also come to give an understanding as to why it is that way. Not to say migration shouldn't go on. Migration, of course, should go on. The world is now a globalized village. We're not North Korea. We shouldn't lock ourselves. Even in North Korea and China, people are still allowed to come down there, and then visas and residence permits are granted to people, and all of those type of conversations down there. So, what am I saying in essence? If you find yourself in Poland, when you look at the buildings, you look at the eras and the different things that have happened and the different locations you find yourself, know that these people are people who've gone through a lot. And it matters that this is really taken into consideration. These people have gone through what? They've gone through a lot. And that should be respected. It shouldn't be taken away. You cannot take that particular piece of information away. You shouldn't take that away. These people have gone through a lot, and that should be respected. That's all. That's all. And at the end of the book, you come to see the shared nostalgia that must have been Adama Mickiewicz's life as it concerns the period he was writing, and the hope he had that his great beloved country would come back to full health. The book is divided into different chapters, divided into different plots, into different conversations. Starts with the farm. Off that backdrop, pulls out to different themes and different conversations down there. Pana Tadeusza, or the last foray in Lithuania. The farm. O Lithuania, my country, thou art like good health. I never knew till now how precious, till I lost thee. Now I see thy beauty whole, because I yearn for thee. O holy maid, who Czestochowa's shrine does guard, and on the pointed gateway shine, and watches Novogrodok's pinnacle, as thou didst heal me by a miracle. For when my weeping mother sought thy power, I raised my dying eyes, and in that hour my strength returned. And to thy shrine I trod, for life restored, to offer thanks to God. So by a miracle thou didst bring us home. Meanwhile, bear of my yearning soul to roam those little wooded hills, those fields beside the Arch on Yemen, spreading green and wild, the vari-painted cornfields like a quilt, the silver of the rye, the wheat fields gilt, where amber trefoil buck with white as snow, and clover with her maiden blushes grew. And all is girdled with a grassy band of green, whereon the silent pear trees stand. Such were the fields where once beside a rill among the beech trees on a little hill there stood a manor house, wood built on stone. From far away the walls with whitewash shone, the whiter as relieved by the dark green of poplars that the autumn winds would screen. It was not large, but neat in every way, and had a mighty barn. 3 stacks of hay stood near it, that the thatch could not contain. Neighborhood was clearly rich in grain, and from the stalks that every cornfield field, as thick as stars, and from the plows that tilled the black earth fields of fallow, broad and long, which surely to the manor must belong, like well-kept flower beds, every one could tell that plenty in that house and order dwell. The gate wide open to the world declared, a hospitable house to all who fared. Across the courtyard swung a coach and pair, and drove up to the pouch and halted there. A young esquire alighted, left to wait. The horses nimbled slowly towards the gate. The house was empty, and the doors were shut and barred, and through the bars the bolt was put. The traveler looked for none to let him in, unbarred the door, and quickly ran within, since he had seen the house long years had passed, and now his schooling over, he returned at last. The ancient walls he hastened to behold as tenderly as they were friends of old. The hangings and the furniture that day were just as when a child he used to play, but smaller and less beautiful withal. And the same portraits hung upon the wall. There in Krakowian code Kosciuszko stands, eyes raised to heaven, a sword in his two hands. Thus at the altar steps he pledged his worth to drive the powers from Poland with that sword, or fall on it. I'm Obinna Emeka.